Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today I'm here to explain to you how to obtain an assistant professorship in the tenured track. So now let's delve into the more specific documents. And before we start the breakdown of each specific one, there's something you should know, should be very aware of, which is the fact that these documents are only going to be read by the search committee if you have made a very strong impression with your cover letter and your CV. I know that from the perspective of the applicant, sometimes you might think that the search committee is going to read each and every one of your documents and then come to a holistic understanding of your application, whereupon they will pass judgment on it and communicate it to you in a timely fashion. However, in reality, most search committees are overworked. They receive 200, 250 applications for the same position, and they have the last 10 minutes of their coffee break to review 50 of those applications. In that context, which is a much more realistic one, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to do one of these two things. They're going to either automatize that process, meaning unless your cover letter contains keywords that have been used for the purpose of writing the job ad in question, your application is not pre-selected and it gets dropped. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is that if it's manually reviewed, the person in question is only going to open your cover letter for a maximum of 5 minutes, scan through the content, maybe read in diagonal the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and make a snap judgment as to whether your application continues to be reviewed or is forgotten altogether. That's going to be the case. So before you worry about the research statement or the teaching statement or the diversity statement, worry about having a perfect cover letter and a brilliant CV. If you have any typos or any questions concerning the cover letter or the CV, do not run to write your research statement, teaching statement, or diversity statement, because it won't matter what you write in those because they won't get read anyway. Now, the second thing that you should know is that all these 3 documents, research, teaching, and diversity statement, merely expand on what you have already mentioned in your cover letter. And they have to be consistent with the content of that cover letter. If you said that the 3 areas of your research are second language acquisition and endangered languages and AI focus on natural language processing, those 3 same areas of research need to be stated as your areas of research within the research statement. Okay, so this is very important that you keep coherence here, consistency across all documents. Now, let's go to the research statement. This statement expands on what you have said about your research in the cover letter. So as you can see on the screen, you will start with a sentence that looks pretty much like the first sentence about your research in the cover letter, meaning my research focuses on such and such topic using such and such methodology. The second paragraph is going to be about your PhD dissertation. In my PhD dissertation entitled X, I used, enter your methodology, to explore, enter your topic, period. Then you can delve into the specifics. Again, you're just expanding what you already hinted at in the cover letter. Essentially, this second paragraph of the research statement is just a shortened version of the dissertation abstract, in fact. So it will be helpful if you first do your dissertation abstract and then start your research statement. So let's talk about the dissertation abstract. In the dissertation abstract, you should, followed by a paragraph where you explain the different parts of the dissertation, and then you delve into each specific chapter. So the first chapter deals with this topic. It begins by doing this. Then it goes on to do that. And the conclusion is that X, Y, Z. The second chapter discusses X. First, it does Y. Second, it does Z, etc. The third chapter, blah, blah, blah. And so on until you reach the final chapter. Okay. And then you devote one paragraph to stating what the conclusion of your dissertation is. The dissertation concludes that blah, blah, blah. And finally, a closing paragraph where you say, overall, my PhD dissertation, followed by the most important impact of your dissertation. For instance, in my case, overall, my PhD dissertation represents the first critical and systematic account written in English on the Spanish media coverage of the attacks of jihadist terrorist resistance in contemporary Spain, particularly as it pertains to the massacres of Madrid and Barcelona. So I'm closing with what makes my dissertation unique and important, because that's what you want the search committee to remember. Again, dissertation abstracts are not commonly requested, but they might be, especially if you're a last year PhD student, an ABD all about dissertation. Let's go back to the research statement then. After you've talked about your dissertation, we go to the third paragraph, in which you should mention your publications as they relate to your PhD dissertation. If your PhD dissertation is about jihadism, you should list what publications do you have on the topic of jihadism that somehow intersect with the content of your thesis. This is because you're not expected to have already published a book based on your thesis. That takes about 2 to 4 years. But you're expected to have published something related to it, ideally a peer-reviewed article in a prestigious journal in the field. So in my case, for instance, I had published a related article in a journal called Critical Studies on Terrorism, which is a prestigious one in that specific field. You can also mention the fact that you are preparing the manuscript which is based on your PhD dissertation. Again, you're not expected to have published that book, but you are expected to be thinking about publishing a book based on your dissertation and having a specific publishing house in mind. And this is the perfect paragraph in which to introduce that information. So we have written 3 paragraphs so far: the summary of your research, your PhD dissertation, and publications related to it, as well as plans for a manuscript based on your dissertation. The fourth paragraph is going to introduce your second topic of research. Remember that I told you in the cover letter that you should have 2 topics of research. One which is directly related to your dissertation, which is the one you're going to mention first, and a second or additional topic which is not going to be perhaps as developed, since it is not directly related to your dissertation, which is what you have devoted most of your time, but still is something you have considered and worked on for a number of months, if not years. So you're going to start that paragraph saying, my second major research project is about this and that. For instance, in my case, my second major research project concerns linguistic justice in the marginalized speech communities of the global Hispanophone, with a focus on how Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, which is the language of the Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, Haketia, and to a minor extent this other language, Chabacano, spawn creative responses to a standardized Spanish that throw into question its geographic, cultural, and linguistic borders as a colonial language. Again, here it's very important, just as much as in the cover letter, that any term which is not self-evident to a general audience, such as Ladino, Haketia, or Chabacano in my case, is explained. You cannot presuppose or assume that the search committee is going to know what you're talking about unless you explain it somewhat succinctly. This paragraph on your second strand of research is then followed by your publications or projects related to this topic. Okay, I have engaged in this community project. I am planning to write this journal article. I have won this visiting fellowship related to it, etc. And then I'm going to write a paragraph stating your publications concerning this second topic, if you have any. You're not expected to have any, but of course, if you do have them and they are peer-reviewed, then that is definitely a plus. Now, if you have a third research topic, now it's the right time to introduce it. If you don't worry, you are not expected or required to, unless, let's say, it's an R1 institution and your previous 2 topics are not fully developed or have any prestigious publication behind. And then the penultimate paragraph is very important. It's going to be about your research plan for the next 4 years, which is to say, your research plan to obtain tenure at the institution that is going to hire you. When they hire you as an assistant professor, you automatically begin what is known as the tenure clock, meaning a number of years, typically 4 or 5, that you have before you apply for promotion to associate professor. If you fail in that application, you have 1 year to look for another job. If you succeed, then you become an associate professor. So the way it works is that for you to be promoted from assistant to associate professor, you need to show evidence that you have excelled at conducting research, teaching, and service. Depending on the institution, your research is going to be prioritized over your teaching or vice versa. And then service is going to be the third most important field. It's not going to be as important as what you have achieved concerning either research or teaching. So here in this paragraph, you are reassuring the search committee that you understand how that tenure process works and that you have a plan in mind whose execution will be equivalent to you getting tenure at that institution. So if it's a research-focused institution, it is very important that you write one detailed paragraph or even 2 paragraphs as to how you intend to proceed with your research in the next 4 years. If the institution is focused on teaching, on the other hand, you don't need to be as specific because it's not going to play a major role in you obtaining tenure, at any rate, not as much as your teaching portfolio. So you see, for instance, here I said my research plan for the next 4 years is to publish 2 journal articles per year in highly respected journals, plus 2 or 3 monographs. These are very high research output, which means that this is an R1 institution. If I were applying for an R2 institution or a teaching college, then I would probably mention just a journal article per year, and that would be more than enough. I wouldn't even need to publish a monograph. And if I needed to, then it would just be 1 monograph in 4 years, right? So you need to adjust this paragraph depending on the research expectations of the institution in question, because that shows very clearly to the search committee that you understand the type of expectation that will be placed on you should you be successful in this application. And then you stick the landing. You end with a paragraph that summarizes everything you've said. Here you want to finish with something that relates to the mission of the institution and something that gestures towards what you will say later on in your diversity or faith statement. For instance, in my case, I said, ultimately, I see my research as a fundamentally emancipatory and empowering effort that focuses on Spanish linguistics and multilingualism to free people, including myself, from the various power knowledge oppressions that prevent them from carrying out their own life projects freely across several languages, cultures, religions, and territories. I am convinced that my work on the above topics will open up new avenues of research in a variety of fields, including Spanish applied linguistics, Hispanic media, corpus linguistics, the social linguistics of the global Hispanophone, and multilingualism. What does this paragraph tell you? It tells you that I am applying to an institution that has a political agenda that is premised on liberalism. So let's say it's left-leaning, right? And so they value inclusivity and emancipation and these types of values. If the institution was not left-leaning, but let's say conservative, for instance, down in the south, then I would have rephrased this in a slightly different way, perhaps emphasizing conservative values, right? So again, you have to bear in mind the kind of institution you're applying for and cater towards that. So that's the research statement. The research statement, as you saw, should be a couple pages. Again, if it's an R1, you can do 2.5 pages. If it's an R2 or a teaching college, you can afford to do 1.5 pages, perhaps 1.7, something like that. Now let's go to the teaching statement. And before we go any further, let me tell you that I'm fully aware that everybody is different and unique. So if you're actually serious about obtaining your assistant professorship this year, book a one-on-one consultation with me, where I'll give you access to the specific institutions and positions I applied for and the documents that got me interviews, as well as the ways in which I handle objections during those interviews and conducted my campus visit to secure the best terms in my negotiation for my assistant professorship. I will also have a look at your specific situation, where is it best to apply for you, what kind of positions are in your best interest, and we will craft together your CV and your cover letter, which are the most important documents, as well as your research statement, teaching statement, diversity statement, and anything else you need. I will also love to coach you for your interviews, help you negotiate your best terms for the offer. And this is one of the best investments you can make in your future, as it will pay for itself already within the first monthly payment as a brand new assistant professor. Book a consultation by clicking on the link below in the description box, and we'll see you on the other side. The teaching statement is more flexible in terms of length. In my experience, if you are applying to an R2 teaching college or community college, your teaching statement should be fairly detailed, around 4 pages. If you are applying to an R1, then you can afford to write just 1 page, 1 page and a half. Okay. Now we're going to see an example of a teaching statement specifically prepared for a teaching-focused institution. So adjust accordingly. If the institution you're applying to is not focused on teaching, you don't need to be as detailed, okay? So let's go for it. Again, the first paragraph of your teaching statement is going to be pretty much the same you wrote as part of your cover letter. You can rephrase it a little bit, but the information should be the same. Teaching is very important to me. These are the courses that I've taught, and these are the institutions where I taught those courses. Now, the second paragraph is going to be a teaching philosophy statement. What is your way of teaching? What is the set of ideas and values that informs your teaching? For instance, I wrote, as an educator of Spanish linguistics, I see my classes as a stimulating conversation in which everyone participates. My role is that of building a community where students belong as equals and work together to support each other. I also strive to apply theoretical concepts and explanations to students' lived experiences, with an emphasis on critical thinking and the use of technology. That is my philosophy. And then you follow up with this sentence. Over the years, I have developed several strategies conducive to this end, meaning now I'm about to tell you the methods that I use to implement this philosophy. So again, this second paragraph of your teaching statement is about your teaching philosophy. And now we go into the specifics. How does that look like in your day-to-day teaching? Here, I would divide the following paragraphs into broad categories. For instance, say that as Spanish scholar, in my case, you teach language classes, Spanish 101, Spanish 400, etc. And then you teach content classes, say romantic literature in Spanish, say modernist literature in Spanish. That's a content course, right? So if that is the case, then I will start with, in my language courses, I do blah, blah, blah. And then in my content courses, I do blah, blah, blah. Okay, you see, I have devoted one entire section to my language courses and one entire section to my content courses. So whatever broad areas you have in the courses you've taught, divide your teaching statement into those areas, delve into each of them before you address the next one. So I said in my case, in my language courses, the first rule at the start of each course, even at the beginner's level, is to always use Spanish, for instance. Always use the target language. And then I say how I implement that. Since language is a social activity, I often invite the whole class to the center of the classroom to interact with different classmates in short shifts. I complement this activity with one-on-one interviews, and I move around listening to them and intervening one group or pair at a time, making sure not to intimidate the students or hurt their sensitivities. At the end of the activity, I review my notes and emphasize for the whole class those contexts that can bring more difficulties. Here is also important that, since we are writing this application in post-pandemic times, you address how you would do each of the things you mentioned in the teaching statement if the classes were online. You might be expected to teach online. At any rate, this is typically perceived as a plus. Some institutions require that you know how to teach online and that you have previous experience in the field. Others just say that it is a plus. At any rate, you should definitely mention it in your teaching statement. Both in the first paragraph, when you mention the courses that you've taught, specify which of them were online, if any. And then when you're breaking down the specific techniques you use to implement your teaching philosophy, specify how you go about that when the classes are in person, and then specify how you go about that when the classes are online. So see, for instance, in my paragraph, after specifying the techniques I utilize in my in-person classes, I say, for my online classes, I use an analogous procedure by assigning students to different breakout rooms, visiting them regularly, and sharing the most relevant information upon returning to the main room, right? That will be the Zoom equivalent. Then another technique that I use is role-playing, right? So I devote the next paragraph to explaining how role-playing works in my classes, the type of activities that I use. And then I finish my analysis of the language courses by specifying techniques that I use for advanced language courses, which are different from beginners ones. Because in the beginners and intermediate level, the specific linguistic elements are much more important, whereas in the advanced language courses, you kind of have to relate those specifics to the broader societal and political issues. So I specify that when it comes to bringing more content rather than a strictly linguistic analysis, these are the sources that I use, and this is how I go about this, both offline and then online. You can also include references to comments made by students in the evaluations, or even the grades assigned to you as an instructor by those students, if those are very good, right? So here I say, for instance, one of my students said the course was very helpful in blending teaching grammar/composition while also deepening our knowledge of Spanish history, culture, current events, etc. Professor Yebre Lopez was very effective in the way he used topics of discussion and analysis. And then when the search committee asks you for your teaching evaluations, they should be able to double check that information against the actual content of the teaching evaluation. So they should be able to locate that quote specifically if it's a verbatim quote, if it's word by word. If you also wrote letters of recommendation for some students, you can mention that. And then you should close your reflections with a general statement on that topic. For instance, promoting and supporting Spanish within college and beyond has always been an integral part of my professional duty. And then I mentioned my service-related work concerning that topic. As a Spanish Fulbright instructor at Missouri Western State University, I served as vice president of the Spanish Club. And that served to boost student recruitment, organizing activities, etc. And then I go with the content courses, the upper level courses, right? And I do the same. I emphasize the techniques that I use. If there's a course you've taught which you feel is particularly relevant for the search committee based on the job ad, then you can specify, hey, for my course entitled this, and that, these are the topics that I addressed, and these are the techniques that I used. Then you want to introduce a transition paragraph, which links your techniques for teaching specific courses with the question of diversity. Now, a caveat here. If you are going to submit a diversity statement, then you don't need to mention that information here. Save it for the diversity statement. Makes sense, right? But if you don't have the chance of uploading a diversity statement, you haven't been requested to do that, then you have to blend it in both the research statement and the teaching statement. And this is a good place to do so in the teaching statements. So see how I did this here. For all the above reasons, I am dedicated to bringing the insights of Spanish linguistics to my students' experiences to assist them in the pursuit and the fulfillment of meaningful lives, both at the local and global level. This, however, here's the transition, can only be accomplished by giving full consideration to the fundamental question of diversity. And then I start a summarized version of my diversity statement. We'll go into that later on, yeah? Okay, and we just have 2 paragraphs to go. The penultimate paragraph is going to talk about your teaching materials and resources and your community engagement projects. So far, you've discussed your teaching philosophy and the techniques you use in each specific course, but you haven't talked about the teaching materials that you have produced and developed and how you have engaged with the broader community outside of the college in question. So you're going to do that here. Have a look at the first sentence. Last but not least, I enjoy creating teaching materials and including technology in my instruction. This is extremely important. You need to address your specific teaching materials, meaning syllabi, resources you have produced, and how you use technology in the classroom, particularly AI. You cannot write a good teaching statement without addressing this question. Remember to always mention technology. You're going to be asked in the interview about that. And by the way, so remember to have that clear in your teaching statement. So for instance, in this year, I published this syllabus. Okay. I used game-based learning platforms such as Kahoot. I have used, say, you can mention here the education platforms you have used, as in Canvas, Moodle, all of that. Each institution uses a different one, but they need to know that you are more or less familiar with this education platform, or you have worked with an equivalent one. And then community engagement projects. For instance, I co-founded this nonprofit. I helped this community close to my college that needed this and that. You can mention activities related to activism as well. Here's where you mention them. And now you're going to stick the landing. Now you're going to bring everything you've said in the previous pages together and make the case as to how everything you've mentioned will contribute positively to your prospective institution. So I mentioned here, for instance, within the department of this university, I will look forward to drawing upon, and now I'm going to mention all the things that I believe are going to be attractive to the search committee that relate to my teaching. Drawing upon my native proficiency in Spanish, sustain successful experience teaching Spanish courses across the curriculum, meaning all levels, beginners, intermediate, upper level, as well as interdisciplinary and first-year courses related to Spanish linguistics. And now you're going to state the purpose for which you draw upon this wealth of experience: to develop and teach introductory and core courses in Spanish linguistics, and to develop courses in my areas of specialization. And that just happens to be exactly what the institution said that they needed in the job ad. What a coincidence. What a happy coincidence. And then you're going to finish this paragraph by mentioning specific courses that you can teach for the institution, particularly those that the institution has already mentioned in the job ad that they need you to teach. So for instance, I say, concerning introductory and core courses in Spanish linguistics, I will be interested in developing a lower division introduction to Spanish linguistics, as well as upper level courses such as semantics and pragmatics and Spanish social linguistics. Additionally, now I'm going to mention the specific courses that they already have that I could teach because I'm qualified to and or have experience in teaching. I will look forward to teaching courses such as, and here, this is going to make a very good impression in the search committee if you can mention the specific code of each course, because it shows professionalism. It shows that you have spent time on the website looking for each specific course and saying, yes, I can teach that. This is how I can help you. They're going to be very impressed if you can pull this off. I can teach Spanish 101, 102, 202. They know what this code means in their specific institution, so you don't need to include the title of the course, which also saves you space, etc. And that's the end of the teaching statement. If you want, you can add an extra paragraph, which I also used in the diversity statement. I will read something like this. I look forward to organizing panels and workshops within the department in question, of the institution in question, to discuss how to continue building a more inclusive academic community, raising my own and others' awareness of who is excluded from the academy and what we can do to break down barriers that exclude them. And that is a very nice way of finishing off these documents, as opposed to just finishing with the courses that you could teach, which might come across as somewhat abrupt. So yeah, feel free to include that last paragraph to bring things in full circle. And finally, the diversity statement. The diversity statement is very interesting because the question you need to answer for the institution is how ideologically compliant you are with their political agenda. That's the name of the game. And this is why I told you in the first video of this series that truth and the pursuit of knowledge are only a small component in a complex matrix of priorities at universities, one of which is to further a specific political agenda which may or may not coincide with yours. So you need to navigate that problem. You're going to have two types of diversity statements: diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, which are characteristic of left-leaning/liberal universities, which are the vast majority of the universities in the US, or faith statements, which are going to be characteristic typically of private Christian-based universities in the US, some of which are very good, others are not as good, and at any rate, they are the vast minority of them. So there's a 90-95% of chances that the kind of statement you need to write is a diversity statement. Hence, I'm going to focus just on that. And if you need to write a faith statement, you can always ask ChatGPT. Diversity statement. The first thing you need to do here is to kind of identify your identity politics label. Are you African American? Are you a BPOC, meaning Black people and people of color? Are you Hispanic? Are you from the US? If you are from the US, are you a Native American? Etc. Based on that, you can choose the label that will most successfully represent you as a minority in need of quotas and special protection by the university as an inclusive institution. That is the name of the game. So in my case, for instance, right, my pigmentation is rather white. However, English is not my first language. I am not from the US. So I can use that to my advantage because these are forms of disadvantage vis-a-vis people who were born and raised in the US who are also white presenting. So I'm going to use that and start the first paragraph with exactly that information as a introduce your identity politics label that frames you as a minority. As a Hispanic scholar and immigrant, this is my way of saying English is not my first language. I'm not from the US, right? I have experienced firsthand, meaning nobody had to tell me about it. It's not hearsay. It's something I have experienced myself. I have experienced firsthand many issues related to diversity in the classroom. I am particularly familiar with challenges faced by students of color, queer students, students with disabilities, impoverished students, and first-generation students. If you identify with any of these categories, you can also mention that at the beginning in the first sentence, right? I am committed to including the fullest range of diverse voices and accents, which is important when it comes to a linguist, in my research and classroom, not least because such inclusion is a fundamental part of a broader struggle for social justice in today's world. Period. And now you introduce a transition sentence that will set you up to explain how you implement that diversity philosophy. So this first paragraph is just about your diversity philosophy and your role within that philosophy. Of course, this reads extremely social justicey because it is. But that is the ethos of most US universities right now. Because we are in the political situation in which we are, this tide may or may not be shifting. But for the time being, liberal left-leaning universities are the vast majority of them. So this is a very safe first paragraph in terms of resonating with the political agenda of my prospective institution. Obviously, this wouldn't fly in conservative institutions down in the South, say in Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, etc. You have to adjust to their specific political agenda. And so perhaps you can gesture towards social inclusivity, but not mention social justice explicitly, right? So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now, how do I go about implementing this diversity philosophy? Well, I mentioned specific techniques that I use, and these are going to be different in your case, so you will be ill-informed to copy what I wrote. I said every semester when I introduce myself, I not only share what I'm from, because I'm not from the US, and what Spain is like, because not everybody has visited Spain, but also the challenges of being a Spanish immigrant living and teaching in the United States, which there are. They're not as bad as coming from other sides of the world, but there are challenges to it. I also take advantage of this moment to discuss various preconceptions about my non-standard accent in English. That is also a source of prejudice, so this is something that I rightly bring up. But I also pair it with the fact that my accent in Spanish is of the standardized form, meaning my accent in Spanish is the privileged accent, whereas in English it's not. So I've seen both sides of the coin. I say, whereas the former, my English accent, tends to lead to negative forms of discrimination, the latter, my accent in Spanish, includes instances of positive discrimination, such as assuming that my variety of Spanish is quote-unquote the best, quote-unquote the purest, quote-unquote the most neutral form of Spanish. I actively seek to dismantle both. Positive prejudices, folks, are forms of prejudice. So you do not identify with any minoritized community. You can always use that to your advantage in the diversity statement by saying, hey, I have experienced these and these positive forms of discrimination that I seek to dismantle, and that I dismantle by doing this, and that. So even if you are heterosexual, white, and born and raised in the US, and WASP, and English is your first language, even in that case, you can still find something to bring up here in the diversity statement, i.e. saying how you fought those forms of positive prejudice and privilege from the inside. Now, I say that after telling my story, I use this as an invitation for me, my colleagues, and my students to reflect on imperialism, colonialism, and how global inequalities and their concomitant ideologies shape our linguistic habits and prejudices. Again, discrimination doesn't operate in a vacuum, it doesn't fall from the sky, it is part and parcel of the broader ideologies and economic systems from which it participates and which it reinforces. I then open the floor, right, and ask everyone to share where they're from. And this is often an opportunity. I don't force my students to tell me where you're from. No, I just say, hey, does anybody else want to share the story? To learn about the challenges they feel they face or think they will face as researchers and students interacting with different cultures. I have found that this introductory exercise frames my academic interaction from the very beginning as a space of inclusivity that is necessary in today's academia. I think that this is a very strong paragraph because it tells you from the get-go that you are aware of the place where you are, where you're coming from, the students that you are encountering, and that you want to build a community from the jump. And this is going to please reviewers. So I suggest you introduce some form of this paragraph in your diversity statement. Now, next paragraph, you want to specify how this strategy is consistent with and translates into specific course materials and assignments that you use to further diversity and inclusivity. The courses I design, such as This and That, Muslim Spain, Queer Temporalities, etc., problematize hegemonic narratives in contemporary Spain. The readings I assign include a variety of voices from different positions of race, ethnicity, gender, and genre. I'm not just talking about minorities from the male, white gaze. I'm letting those minorities speak for themselves and on their own behalf, which is different, right? It's a different degree of inclusivity. In addition to this, the assignments I develop are also opportunities for students to identify and explore their own interests. Furthermore, I make sure they have the option of exploring different formats for their writing assignments, right? Not everybody's comfortable with the run-of-the-mill essay, etc. Now you're going to say how this awareness and appreciation of cultural diversity shown in your teaching is also consistent with your research agenda. So in this paragraph, you're going to say, I utilize this and this inclusive methodology, in my case, critical theory and decolonial studies, to explore and dismantle a number of oppressive practices, such as Islamophobia, political hate against LGBTQAI plus minorities, etc. Okay? And finally, you're going to say this is also reflected in my publications and public outreach initiatives. Here, public outreach initiatives is just another name for community engagement, right? So first, my publications are this and that. For instance, I wrote an article about Islamophobia in Spain. And my community engagement projects are this and that. For instance, I have a digital archive where I conduct interviews with minoritized communities within the nearby of my college, because I'm trying to preserve their endangered language, to showcase their stories with their own voices, etc. And then you stick the landing. You finish with a paragraph that is going to bring together all the main talking points from the previous paragraphs and relate them to your prospective institution. Based on the above, I strongly believe that my unique immigration experience, Hispanic background, and activist scholarship will significantly contribute to the diversity of your campus community. I look forward to organizing panels and workshops within your specific department of your specific university to discuss how to continue building a more inclusive academic community, raising my own and others' awareness of who is excluded from the academy and what we can do to break down barriers that exclude them. This is a great paragraph, as I said before, very useful to bring things in full circle, and it shows empathy and it's tailor-made to the specific institution, but don't abuse it. If you have already used it in your research or teaching statement, you shouldn't use the exact same paragraph in the diversity statements, okay? Because that will come across as lazy and unprofessional. And vice versa. If you use it in your diversity statement, please remove it from your teaching and or research statement and come up with something else. So that's it. These are all the documents you need to apply. Now you are ready to send your application, and we're about to learn what you need to do after you have sent said application.